You're 19 years old. It's the middle of winter. The room smells like smoke, sweat, and damp straw. Outside, rain taps softly against the wooden shutters, while somewhere in the village, a church bell rings in the distance. And then, suddenly, a sharp pain twists through your stomach. Another one follows minutes later. The women around you exchange nervous glances. One quietly whispers a prayer. Another starts boiling water over the fire, because everyone in that room understands something terrifying. There's a real chance you are about to die tonight. And honestly, that wasn't dramatic thinking in medieval times. It was reality. See, when modern people imagine the Middle Ages, they usually think about castles, kings, knights, or giant battles. But for most women, the scariest battle they would ever face happened inside their own homes, lying on a rough wooden bed, surrounded by candles and blood. Pregnancy in medieval Europe was horrifyingly dangerous. No painkillers, no antibiotics, no proper surgery, no understanding of germs, just superstition, primitive medicine, and desperate prayers whispered into the dark. And the truly chilling part? Women were expected to go through this again, and again, and again. Now, imagine growing up already knowing this fate was waiting for you. Little girls in medieval villages often witnessed childbirth long before becoming mothers themselves. They heard the screams through thin wooden walls. They watched exhausted women carried to church after surviving labor. They saw funerals for mothers who never recovered. Death during childbirth was not rare enough to shock people anymore. It was tragically normal. Entire communities became emotionally numb to it. A husband could lose his wife during labor and remarry within months because survival demanded it. Children sometimes grew up barely remembering their biological mothers because pregnancy had taken them so early. It sounds brutal to us today, but in medieval society, this cycle happened constantly. And here comes the first shocking fact. Some medieval women were so terrified of childbirth that they begged priests to prepare last rites before labor even began. Think about that for a second. Last rites were usually given to people expected to die soon. Women entering labor sometimes requested them in advance because the odds felt that serious. In some regions, families even rushed to baptize newborn babies immediately after birth because infant death rates were so high. Parents feared the child could die within hours. Imagine entering motherhood in a world where both mother and baby might not survive the night. That emotional pressure alone must have been unbearable. And unlike today, medieval women couldn't openly talk about anxiety, trauma, or depression. Fear stayed trapped silently inside homes, lit only by candles. What makes this even darker is that medieval medicine often made things worse instead of better. Doctors barely understood the female body. Many believed pregnancy pain was simply part of God's punishment from the story of Eve in the Bible. So suffering was not only expected, it was considered spiritually normal. Some women were told enduring agony during childbirth brought them closer to holiness. Others relied on bizarre remedies that sound absolutely terrifying today. Certain healers used strange herbal mixtures with dangerous side effects. Some mothers drank wine mixed with crushed ingredients nobody fully understood. Others wore religious charms or amulets, believing they would protect the baby from evil spirits. Because in medieval Europe, pregnancy wasn't just medical. It was deeply tangled with religion, fear, superstition, and death. And honestly, one of the creepiest parts about medieval pregnancy is how isolated women often were. Men were usually excluded from the birthing room entirely. Labor became a world of women only. Midwives, mothers, sisters, elderly, neighbors. The room itself could feel suffocating. Windows were sometimes covered to protect the mother from evil spirits. Candles flickered against damp stone walls. The air became heavy with heat, sweat, and panic. And if complications happened, there was very little anyone could do. A baby stuck during labor could mean hours, sometimes days, of unimaginable pain. Some women died slowly from infection afterward, burning with fever while their families watched helplessly. There were no emergency rooms to rush into, no modern monitoring, just waiting, hoping, praying. And yet, despite all of this, women kept doing it. That's the astonishing part. Medieval society depended entirely on women, surviving childbirth often enough to keep villages alive. Kingdoms needed heirs. Farms needed children to work. Families needed sons and daughters simply to survive. Harsh winters and disease outbreaks. Pregnancy was terrifying, but avoiding it was almost impossible. Marriage itself practically guaranteed repeated pregnancies because reliable contraception barely existed. By the time many women reached their 30s, their bodies had already endured years of childbirth, miscarriages, malnutrition, and exhaustion. Some survived, many didn't. And the deeper we go into medieval history, the darker this story becomes. Because childbirth pain was only the beginning. Wait until you hear what medieval doctors actually believed caused labor problems, and the horrifying methods they sometimes used to fix them. Now, here's something that feels almost impossible to imagine today. Medieval women usually gave birth fully awake, feeling everything, every contraction, every tearing pain, every hour of exhaustion stretching into the night. No no anesthesia, not even basic pain relief that actually worked consistently. And the worst part, people in medieval Europe often believed that women were supposed to suffer during childbirth. Seriously? Many religious authorities connected labor pain to the biblical story of Eve eating the forbidden fruit. In other words, pain during childbirth was sometimes treated as a punishment. All women inherited. So instead of trying to eliminate suffering, society often accepted it as natural, even necessary. Imagine hearing that while preparing to give birth. Imagine knowing the people around you expected agony as part of the process. Honestly, it makes the entire atmosphere surrounding pregnancy feel so much darker. Modern childbirth can still be scary, of course, but medieval women entered labor knowing pain wasn't just likely, it was guaranteed. And sometimes that labor lasted not for hours, but for days. There are historical accounts describing women screaming continuously while exhausted. Midwives desperately tried herbs, oils, prayers, and strange rituals to save them. Some women became so dehydrated and weak during prolonged labor that they drifted in and out of consciousness before either surviving or dying slowly in front of everyone. And speaking of midwives, this is where things get fascinating. Because despite how primitive medieval medicine was, midwives were often the true experts of childbirth, far more experienced than many male doctors. These women learned through observation, repetition, and generations of shared knowledge passed quietly between mothers and daughters. A village midwife might help deliver dozens or even hundreds of babies across her lifetime. She knew which herbs eased contractions slightly, which positions helped difficult births, and how to calm terrified mothers during labor. But here comes the disturbing part. Medieval society deeply depended on midwives, while also fearing them at the same time. Some people respected them, almost like healers. Others suspected them of witchcraft. And honestly, when you look at medieval superstition, you can see why fear spread so, as childbirth itself already felt mysterious and dangerous. Women bled heavily, screamed in pain, sometimes hallucinated with fever, and occasionally died for reasons nobody understood. To medieval minds, it probably seemed like invisible supernatural forces were constantly involved. In certain periods, if too many babies died in one village, whispers could begin about whether the midwife had somehow angered God, or worse, some women who practiced healing or childbirth assistance later became targets during witchcraft accusations. Imagine carrying the responsibility of helping mothers survive while also knowing society might blame you if anything went wrong. Now let's talk about medieval pregnancy itself, because honestly, daily life while pregnant sounded miserable. Most women didn't stop working just because they were carrying a child. Poor women, especially, continued hauling water, cooking over for caring for animals, spinning wool, no comfortable prenatal care, no nutritional guidance. In fact, many medieval women were already malnourished before pregnancy even started. Their diets depended heavily on bread, porridge, weak ale, and whatever vegetables or meat their families could afford. During harsh winters or famines, pregnant women sometimes became dangerously weak. And this leads to another shocking fact. Historians believe many babies were born underweight or sickly simply because mothers lacked proper nutrition for months. Imagine trying to grow a healthy child while your own body barely had enough food to survive. Some pregnant women even believed cravings carried spiritual meaning. Others feared certain foods could physically mark the baby with deformities. Medieval superstition around pregnancy became incredibly strange. In some places, women avoided looking at ugly animals or frightening people because they believed fear itself could shape the unborn child's appearance. A sudden shock, loud noise, or traumatic event was thought capable of harming the baby inside the womb. So, pregnancy became filled not only with physical danger, but psychological terror too. And honestly, medieval childbirth rooms themselves sound terrifyingly claustrophobic. Most births happened at home, usually in small dark rooms heated intensely by fireplaces, because people believed warmth protected the mother. Windows were often shut tightly. Fresh air was sometimes avoided because cold air was associated with illness or evil spirits. So imagine this scene for a second. A crowded room glowing with candlelight, thick smoke lingering in the air, exhausted women moving around, carrying cloths and bowls of hot water, while a mother screams in pain on a wooden bed. The smell alone must have been overwhelming. Sweat, blood, smoke, damp fabric, herbs, body odor. And then there were the religious rituals. Crucifixes might hang on walls. Saints were prayed to constantly during labor. Certain charms or holy relics were placed near the mother for protection. Some women clutched written prayers during contractions, believing divine intervention might save them. And honestly, sometimes faith was all people had left, because when childbirth complications happened, survival rates dropped horribly fast. One particularly horrifying complication involved the baby becoming stuck during delivery. Today, doctors can perform emergency C-sections relatively safely. Medieval people could not. A trapped baby often meant unbearable, prolonged suffering for the mother. In some cases, both mother and child died slowly together. There are records describing desperate midwives using brutal methods to remove deceased infants from the womb because saving the mother became impossible otherwise. It's horrifying to think about, but medieval childbirth could become genuinely traumatic beyond anything most modern people ever experience. But perhaps the saddest part of all this is how emotionally normal death became. Communities developed rituals around childbirth because danger was expected. Pregnant women sometimes prepared spiritually for death before labor began. Families prayed constantly, not for a painless birth, but simply survival. Husbands knew there was a real possibility they could lose both wife and baby in a single night. Children understood screaming during labor could end in silence by morning, and yet life continued. Villages kept farming, churches kept ringing bells, people kept marrying and having children because humanity had no choice. That's what makes medieval history simultaneously horrifying and strangely powerful. Human beings adapted emotionally to levels of suffering that would absolutely traumatize most modern societies. And we haven't even reached the truly disturbing medical practices yet, because medieval doctors had theories about pregnancy and childbirth that sound almost unbelievable today, and some of the treatments they recommended were so dangerous they probably killed mothers who otherwise might have survived. Imagine risking your life during pregnancy and then realizing the people responsible for helping you barely understood how the human body even worked. That's the terrifying reality medieval women faced. Because while childbirth itself was already dangerous, medieval medicine made everything even more frightening. Doctors in the Middle Ages didn't know about bacteria. They didn't understand infection. They had no idea how blood circulation truly worked. In fact, some medical beliefs were so wildly incorrect that treatments meant to save pregnant women sometimes pushed them closer to death instead. And the scariest part, these doctors genuinely believed they were helping. Imagine trusting someone during the most vulnerable moment of your life, while they relied on theories that today sound almost insane. But back then, people had little choice. When labor became difficult, families turned desperately toward anyone claiming medical knowledge, even if that knowledge came from ancient myths, religion, or pure superstition. One of the strangest medieval medical ideas was the theory of the four humors. Doctors believed the human body was controlled by four fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. According to this theory, illness happened when those humors became unbalanced. So if a pregnant woman suffered pain, fever, bleeding, exhaustion, or emotional distress, doctors often blamed her body's internal balance rather than actual medical causes. And honestly, this belief led to some horrifying treatments. Bloodletting was one of the most common. Yes, medieval doctors sometimes intentionally removed blood from already weakened pregnant women because they believed it restored balance inside the body. Imagine being exhausted, malnourished, terrified, and pregnant, only for someone to decide the solution was draining your blood with knives or leeches. It sounds unbelievable now, but bloodletting remained common for centuries. And here comes a chilling fact. Some historians believe these treatments likely killed countless patients who might otherwise have recovered naturally. Doctors didn't realize they were weakening immune systems or increasing shock. To them, if the patient died, it often meant God had decided their fate, not that the treatment itself failed. And things become even darker when we look at medieval ideas surrounding the female body specifically. Women were often viewed as physically weaker, emotionally unstable, and spiritually vulnerable compared to men. Some medieval scholars genuinely believed the womb itself could wander inside the body, causing illness. A bizarre concept later called the wandering womb. Symptoms like anxiety, dizziness, pain, or emotional distress could all be blamed on female reproductive organs behaving unpredictably. It sounds ridiculous today, but imagine living in a world where medicine treated women almost like mysterious biological puzzles rather than human beings needing scientific care. Pregnancy became surrounded by myths and fear because nobody truly understood what was happening internally. Even miscarriages were often interpreted through superstition or religion rather than medical reality. Some people believed evil spirits caused pregnancy complications. Others blamed sinful thoughts, curses, or improper behavior by the mother herself. So, if something went wrong during pregnancy, women sometimes carried crushing guilt on top of physical suffering. Imagine grieving a lost baby while also fearing society believed you somehow caused it spiritually.com. Now, let's talk about pain relief, or rather, the terrifying lack of it. Medieval medicine had herbs and homemade remedies, but nothing remotely close to modern anesthesia. Some women drank alcohol during labor to dull pain slightly. Others used herbal mixtures containing dangerous ingredients like opium-based substances or toxic plants, though dosages were wildly inconsistent and sometimes deadly. And honestly, Many remedies probably did more harm than good. Certain treatments caused hallucinations, poisoning, or severe sickness. But when labor pain became unbearable, people were willing to try almost anything. One especially disturbing practice involved tying religious objects or written prayers directly onto the mother's body during childbirth. Charms, relics, saint medallions, and sacred texts were believed to protect women from death. In some cases, birthing girdles, long cloths, inscribed with prayers, were wrapped around pregnant women like magical protection. Think about how desperate society must have been for people to place survival hopes on written words wrapped around the stomach. It reveals something heartbreaking about medieval childbirth. Even experienced midwives and doctors often knew they lacked real control over what happened. And honestly, one of the creepiest things about medieval medicine is how dangerous surgery was before germ theory existed. Today, surgery happens inside sterile rooms with disinfected tools, antibiotics, and trained teams. Medieval surgery, completely different nightmare. Instruments were reused repeatedly without proper cleaning. Because nobody understood microscopic infection, doctors moved from patient to patient with contaminated hands. Surgical pain was indescribable because anesthesia barely existed. And when childbirth complications required invasive procedures, mortality rates became horrifyingly high. Some women survive labor only to die days later from infection, their bodies burning with fever while helpless families watch nearby. Modern historians believe postpartum infections killed enormous numbers of women throughout history. But medieval people didn't understand why fevers suddenly appeared after childbirth. That's what makes medieval pregnancy so terrifying. Women faced danger not only from childbirth itself, but from an entire medical system trapped in ignorance. And the deeper we go into this world, the more disturbing these practices become, because next, we're going to explore the horrifying superstitions people believed could determine whether a baby lived or died. Now, here's where medieval pregnancy starts to feel less like medicine and more like surviving inside a world ruled by fear and superstition. Because when people don't understand science, demons, sins, and supernatural danger, it was seen almost like a fragile spiritual state. Honestly, the amount of pressure this placed on women must have been emotionally exhausting. Imagine believing one wrong action, one frightening sight. Some women avoided funerals during pregnancy because death was. Others feared eclipses, storms, certain animals. In some regions, pregnant mothers were warned not to stare at ugly faces or violent scenes because people believed terrifying images could somehow mark the child inside the womb. It sounds bizarre now, but to medieval families, these fears felt completely real. And honestly, some of the rituals surrounding pregnancy were deeply unsettling. Women carried protective charms constantly. Certain herbs were sewn into clothing to repel evil. Religious relics were placed near beds. Midwives whispered prayers during labor almost nonstop in difficult pregnancies. Some families even traveled long distances, hoping a particular saint's shrine could save the mother or child. Think about how desperate someone must feel to believe. Survival depends on touching a holy object or repeating prayers correctly. But when medicine repeatedly failed people, superstition naturally filled the gap. Medieval Christians often viewed labor as spiritually dangerous because pain, blood, and suffering were associated with both sin and death. Some believed evil spirits waited for moments of weakness to harm newborn babies before baptism. And this led to another shocking fact. If a baby appeared weak after birth, families sometimes rushed emergency baptisms immediately because they feared the infant might die within minutes and spend eternity without salvation. Imagine giving birth while everyone around you worries not only about physical survival, but the eternal fate of your child's soul. Now let's talk about something truly horrifying: medieval Cs. Today, cesarean births are incredibly common and often safe thanks to modern surgery. In medieval times, absolutely terrifying. For most of the Middle Ages, C-sections were usually performed only after the mother had already died or was clearly dying. That's because surgery on a living woman almost always ended disastrously due to pain, bleeding, and infection. The primary goal was often to save the baby, for baptism rather, than save the mother herself. Just imagine the horror of that situation. A woman struggling through impossible labor, while people around her realize neither medicine nor midwives can help anymore. And without antibiotics or sterile procedures, even surviving the operation was extraordinarily rare. Historians debate exactly how often living women survived medieval but one thing is clear. The odds were horrifyingly low. Physically, while crude surgical tools were used in candlelit rooms, no anesthesia beyond alcohol or herbal mixtures, no understanding of internal infection, no modern stitching techniques. Honestly, it's difficult to even imagine that level of suffering was how society quietly normalized female suffering. Women were expected to endure pain silently because motherhood was considered their duty. And if a mother died, communities mourned, yes, but life moved on quickly because death was so common. Husbands remarried, babies were handed to relatives. There's something emotionally chilling about how ordinary this tragedy became. Today, a maternal death feels shocking and catastrophic. In medieval Europe, people sadly expected it as part of life. Some noble women even wrote wills while pregnant because they understood childbirth could kill them at any time. Think about that. Preparing legal documents before labor because death felt statistically possible among queens and aristocrats often destroyed their health over time. Royal women were pressured constantly to produce heirs, especially sons, pregnancy after pregnancy, regardless of exhaustion or previous traumatic births, because kingdoms depended on succession. Some died young after years of childbirth complications, infections, or weakened body. Behind the glamorous image of castles and crowns was a terrifying biological reality no wealth could fully escape. And honestly, the psychological fear surrounding pregnancy may have been just as devastating as the physical danger. Medieval women entered labor knowing many others never came back from it. They had heard the stories. They had seen grieving husbands and motherless children. Some women likely carried trauma from previous births with absolutely no emotional support afterward. Imagine surviving a brutal labor only to become pregnant again months later. No more therapy, no medical reassurance, no guarantee you would survive twice. That cycle repeated endlessly across generations. And yet, despite all this suffering, women still formed incredibly strong communities around childbirth. Midwives, sisters, mothers, neighbors. They became emotional lifelines. In a terrifying world, women sang prayers together, held laboring mothers through contractions, and comforted one another after loss. There's something strangely powerful about that human connection, surviving inside such brutal conditions. But we haven't even reached the truly disturbing realities of infant survival yet. Because for medieval parents, giving birth was only the beginning of the nightmare. Keeping the baby alive afterward was another terrifying battle entirely. Imagine surviving one of the most painful and dangerous experiences imaginable, only to realize the fear isn't over yet. That was medieval parenthood. Because even after a woman somehow survived childbirth, another terrifying reality immediately appeared. The baby might still die within days, weeks, or months. And honestly, this is one of the saddest parts of medieval history. Modern parents naturally worry about their children, but medieval families lived under a constant shadow of loss. Most people today can barely comprehend. Infant death was heartbreakingly common in some regions. Historians believe enormous percentages of children died before reaching adulthood. Disease, malnutrition, infections, contaminated water, cold winters, and poor medical knowledge turned early. childhood into an incredibly fragile stage of life. So, when a medieval mother finally held her newborn baby after hours of agony, relief mixed immediately with fear. Survival was never guaranteed. And the terrifying thing is, medieval parents knew this very well. They had seen too many tiny graves already in villages and towns across Europe, cemeteries filled with children who never had the chance to grow up. Some families lost multiple babies, one after another. Imagine the emotional toll of that. A mother spends months pregnant, risks death during labor, finally survives childbirth, and then watches helplessly as fever or sickness slowly takes her child anyway. Honestly, it's difficult to even emotionally process how normalized grief became during this period. Some historians believe medieval parents sometimes delayed becoming too emotionally attached to newborns immediately because survival remained uncertain during the earliest months. That sounds cold to modern ears, but when death surrounded daily life constantly, emotional self-protection became part of survival itself. Still, parents absolutely loved their children deeply. You can see it in letters, prayers, poems, and religious records. Medieval mothers cried for lost babies just as painfully as modern mothers would. The difference is they experienced that heartbreak far more often. Now here comes one of the darkest, shocking facts of medieval childhood. Baptism was considered so urgent that week, newborns were sometimes baptized immediately after birth because families feared the baby might die before reaching church. Think about how terrifying that mindset is. Parents weren't only afraid of physical death, they feared spiritual consequences too. In medieval Christian Europe, many believed unbaptized infants could not enter heaven properly. So, if a newborn appeared sickly, pale, or struggled breathing, panic spread quickly inside the household. Midwives themselves were sometimes authorized to perform emergency baptisms during life-threatening births because waiting for a priest felt too risky. Imagine entering the world and immediately becoming surrounded by fear that your soul itself might be in danger. It reveals how deeply religion shaped emotional life during the Middle Ages. Every illness carried not only medical anxiety, but spiritual terror as well. And honestly, keeping babies physically healthy in medieval homes was unbelievably difficult. Houses were cold, smoky, crowded, and often filthy by modern standards. Animals sometimes lived extremely close to humans. Water contamination caused constant disease. Fleas, lice, and rats spread sickness everywhere. And because nobody understood germs, families unknowingly created dangerous environments for newborns constantly. Even feeding infants carried risks. Breastfeeding was the safest option. But if a mother died during childbirth, which happened often, babies suddenly faced another survival crisis. Wealthier families sometimes hired wet nurses, women paid to breastfeed another person's child. But poor families didn't always have that option. Some infants were fed animal milk or primitive mixtures that could make them dangerously ill. And here's another disturbing fact. In crowded medieval cities, foundling homes and orphan care conditions could become horrifyingly deadly. Abandoned babies sometimes died in huge numbers because institutions lacked hygiene, nutrition, or proper care. It's heartbreaking to think how fragile early life truly was back then. But perhaps one of the creepiest realities of medieval parenting was how mysterious illness seemed to people. Today, doctors can explain infections, viruses, fevers, dehydration. Medieval families couldn't. A healthy baby could suddenly become sick overnight with symptoms nobody understood. Fever, coughing, seizures, diarrhea. These things terrified families because treatment options were limited and often useless. Some people blamed evil spirits. Others feared curses or divine punishment. Parents hung protective charms near cribs or prayed desperately to saints for healing. Certain illnesses spread through villages like invisible death itself, especially during harsh winters. And honestly, The emotional helplessness must have been unbearable. Imagine holding your burning fever child in a candlelit room while knowing nobody around you truly understands what's happening. No antibiotics, no hospitals, no emergency care, just waiting, hoping, praying the child survives until morning. And sometimes, morning came with silence instead. And if you think medieval parents finally got to relax once a baby survived infancy, not even close. Childhood in the Middle Ages remained incredibly dangerous almost every single day. Modern parents worry about screen time, school grades, or sugar intake. Medieval parents worried their children might freeze during winter, starve during famine, drown in rivers, catch deadly infections, or simply disappear into the brutal unpredictability of medieval life. Honestly, survival itself was a full-time struggle. Children grew up surrounded by sharp tools, open fires, disease, heavy labor, and dangerous living conditions. Even ordinary homes could become deadly. Candles cause fires constantly. Smoke from indoor hearts damaged lungs. Water sources carried sickness. And because medicine barely worked, even small injuries sometimes turned fatal through infection. A simple cut could slowly become a nightmare. What's especially shocking is how quickly medieval children entered adult responsibilities. There was no long protected childhood like today. Poor children especially began working at very young ages. A little girl might help carry water, prepare food, clean animals, or watch younger siblings before reaching 10 years old. Boys worked in fields, workshops, farms, or apprenticeships, while still physically tiny. And honestly, childhood exhaustion must have been overwhelming. Many children were chronically malnourished, meaning their bodies developed under constant stress. Historians studying medieval skeletons have found evidence of stunted growth, disease, and physical labor beginning early in life. Imagine being 8 years old and already expected to contribute significantly to your family's survival. Play existed, of course, but survival always came first. And during bad harvests or famines, children suffered terribly because weaker bodies struggled most when food disappeared. Now here comes one of the most disturbing facts about medieval parenting. Families sometimes became emotionally familiar with death in ways modern society would find unbearable. In certain households, multiple children might die across the years from illness or famine. Parents grieved repeatedly throughout life. Imagine burying one child, then another, then another. Some mothers spend huge portions of adulthood pregnant, recovering from childbirth or mourning losses. And because death happened so often, medieval art and religion constantly reminded people about mortality. Skeleton imagery, warnings about death, religious sermons about suffering. These themes surrounded daily life from childhood onward. Kids grew up understanding life could end suddenly at any moment. Honestly, it created a psychological atmosphere that feels almost haunting compared to modern childhood. There's something deeply sad about children becoming emotionally familiar with funerals before they even fully understood the world. And yet, despite all this darkness, medieval parents still loved their children fiercely. That's something modern people sometimes misunderstand. The Middle Ages were brutal, but families absolutely formed deep emotional bonds. Mothers sang lullabies, fathers taught skills patiently, parents prayed desperately for sick children, some surviving letters from later. Medieval periods reveal heartbreaking grief after child deaths. One father described feeling emotionally destroyed after losing his son. A mother wrote prayers begging God to spare her daughter from illness. Love absolutely existed, maybe even more intensely, because life felt so fragile. Imagine knowing every healthy day with your child was genuinely precious because survival odds remained uncertain. In some strange way, constant danger may have made family connections feel even more emotionally important. But unfortunately, love alone couldn't protect children from the terrifying diseases. constantly waiting around them. And honestly, the diseases themselves were horrifying. Measles, smallpox, dysentery, plague, pneumonia, illnesses spread rapidly through medieval communities, especially crowded towns and cities, without vaccines or antibiotics. Outbreaks could become catastrophic almost overnight. One particularly terrifying thing about medieval disease was how invisible and mysterious it seemed. People watched healthy neighbors suddenly collapse with fever and had absolutely no scientific explanation why. During epidemics, fear spread faster than facts. Some blamed poisoned air. Others prayed continuously between contractions, believing survival depended equally on God and the midwife. One especially disturbing detail from historical accounts describes women becoming delirious from prolonged labor, mumbling prayers or hallucinating from fever and exhaustion, while the room around them descended deeper into fear. But perhaps the creepiest thing about medieval birthing rooms was how close life and death constantly felt. Candles burned beside religious symbols, while midwives quietly watched for signs the mother might not survive. Priests could be summoned urgently if labor turned catastrophic. Emergency baptisms happened beside exhausted mothers, still bleeding from childbirth. Sometimes the room that welcomed new life became the same room where someone died before mourning, and everyone present had seen it happen before. That's what gives medieval childbirth its uniquely haunting atmosphere. People weren't entering birth with confident optimism. They were entering something unpredictable and genuinely dangerous. Yet, despite all the fear, women continued returning to these rooms, generation after generation, because society depended on them doing so. And next, we're going even deeper into the terrifying medical emergencies that turned some medieval births into scenes of absolute horror. Now imagine the room growing quieter. The contractions have been happening for hours, maybe even more than a full day. The mother is exhausted beyond words. Sweat soaks her clothes. Candles are burning lower. Midwives exchange worried glances without saying much aloud. Something feels wrong. And honestly, this moment was probably one of the most terrifying experiences medieval families could face, because difficult labor often meant everyone inside that room slowly realized death was approaching while being almost powerless to stop it. Today, doctors can monitor heart rates, oxygen levels, and internal complications in real time. Medieval people had none of that. They judged danger through instinct, experience, and fear. If labor lasted too long, if the mother stopped responding normally, or if the baby failed to emerge correctly, panic spread rapidly. One horrifying complication medieval women feared was excessive bleeding after childbirth. Today, postpartum hemorrhage is treatable in many cases with surgery, medication, and blood transfusions. In the Middle Ages, it could become a death sentence within hours. Imagine surviving agonizing labor only to suddenly begin bleeding uncontrollably while everyone around you desperately tries useless remedies. Midwives used cloves, herbs, prayers, pressure techniques. Anything they believed might stop the bleeding simply grew weaker and weaker until consciousness faded. And the truly chilling part is how helpless families must have felt watching this happen in real time. A husband waiting outside might hear crying suddenly stop. Children sleeping nearby might wake to whispered prayers and panic. By sunrise, a healthy young woman could be dead simply because her body lost too much blood during childbirth. Honestly, it's terrifying how fragile survival truly was. And then there were infections, one of the deadliest invisible killers in medieval childbirth. This is where things become especially disturbing, because nobody understood what was actually causing the illness. A woman might appear to survive labor successfully, only to develop fever days later. Her skin grew hot, pain intensified, weakness spread through the body, the room filled again with fear as family members realized something terrible was happening. Today, we know postpartum infections often came from bacteria entering the body during or after labor. Medieval people had absolutely no idea. Midwives reused cloths and tools repeatedly without sterilization because the concept of germs simply didn't exist yet. Hands moved between patients without washing properly. Surgical instruments carried infection from one birth to another unknowingly. And here's one of the darkest, shocking facts of all. Countless women throughout history likely died from infections that modern antibiotics could cure easily within days. Imagine entire generations suffering and dying simply because humanity had not yet discovered microscopic bacteria. It's honestly one of the most tragic realities in medical history. But perhaps the most emotionally horrifying situations involved babies who became trapped during labor. The room could descend into hours of mounting terror, while midwives tried desperately to save both mother and child. Sometimes the baby's position made delivery nearly impossible. Sometimes the infant died during labor itself while still inside the womb, placing the mother in even greater danger. Historical records describe brutal emergency procedures carried out in candlelit rooms using crude instruments because there were simply no safe alternatives. And honestly, some of these procedures sound almost unbearable to imagine. No anesthesia beyond alcohol or herbal sedatives. No sterile environment. No modern surgical training. Just desperate attempts to prevent total catastrophe. Midwives themselves must have carried enormous emotional trauma from witnessing these births repeatedly across their lives. Imagine helping deliver babies for decades while constantly watching women suffer, scream, bleed, or die under circumstances you cannot fully control. And yet somehow, after all this darkness, medieval communities still tried to create moments of hope inside these terrifying rooms. If the baby cried successfully after birth, relief must have exploded emotionally through the house. Women thanked God aloud. Family members wept with joy. Church bells sometimes rang for surviving mothers and newborns because survival truly felt miraculous. That's the part modern people often forget. Medieval childbirth was so dangerous that healthy outcomes genuinely seemed like blessings from heaven itself. Every surviving mother represented victory against terrifying odds. Every healthy infant felt precious because death had stood so close only moments earlier. And maybe that's why medieval families loved so fiercely. Despite living inside constant danger, they understood something modern society often forgets. Life itself was fragile, horribly fragile. But the story becomes even more haunting from here, because next we're going to explore how queens, noble women, and royal mothers faced many of the same childbirth terrors. Despite all their wealth and power, you'd think being a queen in medieval Europe would protect a woman from the horrors of childbirth. Massive castles, servants everywhere, rich food, the best physicians in the kingdom. But honestly, royal pregnancy was often just as terrifying, and sometimes even worse. Because for queens and noble women, childbirth wasn't only about survival, it was political. Entire kingdoms depended on their bodies producing healthy heirs, especially sons. One successful birth could secure dynasties. One failed pregnancy could throw nations into chaos. Imagine carrying not only a baby, but the expectations of an entire kingdom inside your womb. That emotional pressure alone must have been crushing. And the terrifying truth is that royal women died in childbirth frighteningly often. History books celebrate kings, wars, and castles. But hidden behind so many royal dynasties is a trail of exhausted women destroyed by repeated pregnancies. Queens were expected to give birth again and again because infant mortality remained high and succession depended on surviving heirs. Some noble women spent most of their adult lives pregnant. Their bodies barely recovered before another pregnancy began. And unlike ordinary women, royal pregnancies happened under constant public scrutiny. Courtiers watched anxiously. Priests prayed publicly. kingdoms waited nervously for news of a male heir. Imagine going into labor knowing your survival affects politics, alliances, inheritance, and the future of entire bloodlines. Honestly, it sounds emotionally suffocating. One especially disturbing reality was how little privacy royal women had during childbirth. In some medieval courts, noble births became semi-public events because witnesses needed proof the child truly belonged to the royal bloodline. Think about how horrifying that is. A woman enduring unimaginable pain while surrounded not only by midwives, but political observers making sure no deception occurred. Childbirth transformed into a royal performance where failure carried enormous consequences. And if a queen struggled to produce sons, pressure intensified brutally. Some kings blamed wives for miscarriages or daughters being born instead of sons, despite modern science, proving sex is determined biologically by the father. But medieval people didn't understand genetics, so women often carried unfair blame for reproductive outcomes beyond their control. And here comes one of the darkest shocking facts in royal history. Some queens continued becoming pregnant even after repeated traumatic births, nearly killed them because refusing pregnancy simply wasn't considered acceptable. Their bodies became political tools for survival of the dynasty. There are records of royal women weakened permanently by years of childbirth, miscarriages, infections, and exhaustion. Some died in their 20s or 30s after producing multiple children in rapid succession. And honestly, wealth could not save them from the biggest dangers of medieval childbirth. Bleeding, infection, obstructed labor, fever. A castle might provide luxurious, but it could not provide antibiotics or modern surgical care. In the end, queens often faced the same terrifying biological risks as peasant women lying in tiny village homes. But perhaps the saddest part is realizing how many women throughout medieval history disappeared quietly behind the survival of kingdoms and families. We remember kings because they ruled nations. We remember battles because they changed borders. Yet, generation after generation of women endured unimaginable pain simply to keep society alive. They survived childbirth without painkillers, buried children lost to disease, faced death repeatedly with almost no medical protection, and somehow humanity continued because they did. That's what makes medieval pregnancy history so haunting. Beneath every castle, every royal bloodline, every medieval village, there were women carrying the physical terror of survival on their shoulders. So, the next time someone romanticizes medieval life, the castles, the dresses, the candlelit halls, the knights and kings, remember the hidden reality most people never talk about. For women, medieval pregnancy could be one of the most dangerous experiences imaginable. No painkillers, no antibiotics, no modern surgery. And honestly, the deeper you look into history, they lived in a world where childbirth could turn fatal overnight, where medicine barely understood the human body, and yet they kept going. They loved, survived, mourned, and rebuilt families again and again, inside conditions that would terrify most modern people. And maybe that's why medieval history feels so strangely emotional, because beneath all the darkness, you still see human resilience everywhere. Midwives comforting frightened mothers by candlelight, families praying desperately for newborn survival, women holding each other through unbearable pain. Even in the harshest conditions imaginable, people still search for hope. But honestly, after hearing all this, one thing becomes painfully clear. You absolutely would not want to be pregnant in medieval times.